key thing is that there are about 17 of these essential nutrients that are basically necessary to sustain all of life. The ones that are needed in the greatest quantity are called the macro, and then the ones needed in sort of trace amounts, so kind of like very small amounts, are your micronutrients. Thank you. So nitrogen is so important because it is essential for growth. It's essential for all of this leafy matter that we see around us, and it's also a part of the chlorophyll molecule. So when you see a nitrogen deficiency, then you'll see the grass tends to go yellow, and that's because the chlorophyll isn't forming properly because there's not enough nitrogen. So the chlorophyll, of course, is what the pigment that gives leaves their green colour, and where photosynthesis occurs. So it's like when you go camping for a bit, you take away your tent, the grass has gone yellow, and then there's not enough nitrogen left there. The chlorophyll fades. So vital to all organisms. So organisms work together to obtain sufficient amounts of nitrogen in the system, and they work together to keep that nitrogen there. So again, it's this combination of the different components, all sort of like creating something which then benefits the greater whole. So it's worth just making a few distinctions here. So when we're talking about nitrogen fixing plants, we're talking about various groups of plants, but they might fix nitrogen in different ways. Okay, so we've got 3 different types of bacteria, and again, really, arguably, these, they are important to know at this point, because it will help you understand, I think, tie the other things together really, because it is a bit of a hard concept to get around how this stuff we can't see ends up there, and then how it's utilised.
Okay, so when I looked at this, I thought these were a subset of this, but they're not.
No,
okay.
No, it looks like it should be like that, and I don't know quite why. I don't know. Yeah.
Good.
So diazotrophs, they're a type of bacteria that are actually freely living in the soil. Okay, so they're freely living in the soil, and I believe that they are what you call nitrifying bacteria, and they are able to turn, I think, still the nitrogen in the air that's in the ground, that enters the air through all the pore spaces, through the good structure of soil that we have because of all the organisms moving around in there, and they turn it into nitrate, which is a form that is plants are able to uptake into their roots. So some plants prefer their nitrogen in nitrate form. Other plants prefer it in ammonium form, which is basically why wheat is really good for those plants. So trees and shrubs, that's why we need to utilise wheat more. I don't know if you saw Martin Crawford's little portable toilet that he takes around.
He had a
it's like a little kind of tent. And well, no, it's basically like so it's like a compost loo, but he'll move it every few weeks or something, and then just fill that hole. So a combination of that nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium in both the solids and the liquid, really good. Move it on. So
do you have to dilute urine before you add it to soil?
No, you don't actually. No. So well, it depends what you're using it for, but I mean, for shrubs and for fruit trees, you don't have to. And actually, in the book, in Creating a Forest Garden book, he talks about, when he talks about starting to predict how much of these nutrients you need for different kinds of plants, because he talks about nutrient budgeting, which is a rough calculation of looking at all the major plants you have in your system, and you can work out from calculating canopy cover of your undemanding, which we covered before, your moderately cropping, and your heavily cropping fruits. You can work by working out a rough diameter of canopy cover. You can then, there's a calculation he gives on how to figure out how much of the different nutrients you need. And he measures wheat and peas, so like one mature apple tree for 1 year's growth works out at 1p a week, or something like that. And again, that's a little bit like, it totally varies, doesn't it?
When it's in the growing season, when it's producing,
during its growing season,
it's a wee a week for every apple tree.
Yeah.
So you need to kind of like move
so you know, some weeds are bigger than other weeds. So I suppose that size is probably
it's worse.
It's more smelly, male weed, but actually that is another benefit that comes from that, is actually deterring other mammal other mammals. So for example, things like squirrels and foxes, if you're having an issue with them leaving you little presents in the soil, this can be quite unpleasant. Actually, manwe is quite good at deterring
Why is
those.
manwe
Some kind of
smellier?
territorial hormone. It's something to do with the hormone. Some hormones in it. I don't know
It's
whether
marking,
it's
for
like
marking
must be
territory. It's for that reason.
I didn't
Yeah.
know that. I thought it was because,
So these two are the ones that are actually make symbiotic associations with plants. So when we talk of symbiotic, similar to the fungi and the plant root, two organisms working together and evolving in a way where they both need each other and they both take something but they both give something. So these two there's two different main groups of nitrogen fixing plants, and these are the key way really of making sure there's enough nitrogen in a forest garden. It is by building in, designing in nitrogen fixers into your design. Okay, so you've got the plants such as legumes or legumes, however you want to say that, which are so beans, for example, all the way through to clovers. So clovers are really good. You hear about people using clovers as a green manure, as a cover crop. So this is the rhizobia, and they're in symbiosis with these legumes. And if you look at the diagram in the back, second to back page, you can see the roots there. You have these nodules. So these nodules form on these roots, and actually those nodules provide surface area for those bacteria to live on. And the bacteria also utilise some of the carbon that the plant exudes through these secretions. Okay, and there's a little diagram there about how that nitrogen is then released into the soil into a form where it's then made available. And actually, again, importantly, is to note that with these, they always produce more than they need, so there's always excess nitrogen going into the system.
Can I just say something briefly about that? And that is that we're growing some soybeans here. They're planted in that bed behind you, and that's a plant that is a nitrogen fixer. And one of the things I learned in the process of doing some research about that was that these nitrogen fixers, these Fabaceae plants, they only create those nodes if there is a need, like if the soil hasn't got enough nitrogen already in it. So if you're planting them into nutrient-rich soil, you won't see those little nodes developing on the root system, which I think is really
It's
interesting.
amazing, absolutely amazing, isn't it?
And soy has got a specific fungus that it has this relationship with. So whereas most plants have got a very sluttish relationship with the fungi that's knocking around, soy is not like that. It's discriminating and choosing who it chooses to.
You know, you mentioned clover,
Yeah,
but is clover a legume? 'Cause I
Yes.
thought legumes were just
yeah.
ones with
No
crops.
clovers in my family. Yeah.
Because I know it's related, but I thought legume was.
Well, when I say
plants that
family,
had
maybe not
pods.
that. I mean, it's within that group. I mean, yeah, they're definitely classed as the legumes. Yeah.
To do with the nitrogen crops. That's what it's doing.
Yeah, they don't all produce beans essentially, so it's not about whether they produce what we what we associate with beans, but it's still within that family. The thing with clover is that might be more suitable for like an orchard situation where you've got much more light reaching the floor, because actually clover's nitrogen fixing capability is quite dependent on getting enough sunlight. So arguably the best the most conventional way to include nitrogen into a forest garden system is with this relationship, which is actually more things like your Elaeagnus, alders, the trees we talked about before, things like sea buckthorns, so more like the shrubs for woody plants. And these again are what we're talking about when we're talking about these the pioneer species. So these are some of these from the same group. These plants that create associations with the Frankia bacteria, they're the ones that actually come into a place where there isn't sufficient nitrogen and start creating that nitrogen as part of that succession as we're going back towards a forest ecosystem. So nitrogen from nitrogen fixers are made by three main natural methods. So with these trees, it's often the litter fall, so the leaves that are coming down, the twig fall, root turnover. So again, this is this whole idea that roots are constantly growing and dying back, and when the plant dies, all of its root mass underground is a huge source of nitrogen. And then, of course, you've got the mycorrhizal fungi, which are connecting it all together and then transporting that around in this kind of this sort of internet of nutrient exchange that's going on below the ground. So other things, so again, refer to the book with looking at calculating how much tree cover, how much canopy cover you need for this nitrogen fixation, and it all depends on how many of the more moderately cropping plants that you're building into it. And also, it's worth thinking about positioning as well. So maybe positioning, although nutrients will get transported around, you can help it along by planting these nitrogen fixing trees and shrubs closer maybe to those plants that are going to require more nutrients.
What's root turnover?
Root turnover is where roots are constantly growing. The young feeder roots that are doing all of the absorption, they're often growing and dying back. They grow a bit, die back, and they're constantly, as a result of that, they're shedding all of these nutrients, and all of the organisms are kind of like utilising not only what they're exuding when they're growing, but also the root material once it dies off. So you'll hear it. Some people refer to it as sloughing off the roots as well. In the Holistic Orchard book, he's always talking about roots being sloughed off. Root turnover.
And it's worth knowing as well that it's the really fine roots that are doing all the work, that are doing all the exchange with the stuff. So those really thick woody roots that you can see when you're looking at them, they're actually not being anything other than a placeholder for the fine roots.
And more of an anchor, so sort of holding the plant there.
Can you overdo the nitrogen fixing?
Yes, you can.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know about a bit nitrogen fixing. You can overfeed. So one problem with it is good to try and figure out how much you think you're going to need, because the problem with giving too much nitrogen is plants will grow very quickly, and when they grow very quickly, because of the way the cells form, you get what's called sappy growth, where, for example, in an apple tree, you'll get lots of new shoots, but the wood's not very tough, and because of that, they're more susceptible to predation. So they're more like aphids and things like that feed through either the leaves or through the young bark will actually go to those. They'll be attracted to that kind of plant. So too much nitrogen can be a bad thing, and I suppose ultimately that's why with a system like a forest garden, where you're relying primarily on the plants to control that, then the amount of nitrogen that's passing around should be related to where it's needed, and it should be getting moved around to where it's needed, so it's less of a concern for us. If we were cultivating like some land that was highly, we'd kind of been cultivating it lots and like ploughing or digging or whatever, and we'd lost some of that soil diversity, we'd lost the mycorrhizal connections, and we were constantly having to add it, that's where it's going to be a bit more of a problem, like really figuring out exactly how much you need. So other good sources then, so comfrey again. Comfrey is an amazing plant. It's one of these kind of multifunctional plants really that has a lot of uses. It's got the deep tap roots, brings back all of these nutrients up into the leaves, and once in the leaves you can either cut the leaves and make a tea, like the same you'd make a nettle tea, just soak the leaves in water for a few weeks until it smells like hell, and then use that to water your plants with. Again, in this situation, that might not be such an issue because if you're covering, depending on the size of it as well, you don't want to be going around doing watering. But it's very good feed for apple trees and fruit trees that we use quite a lot. Or you can just chop and drop, which is actually the less energy way to do it. So because it keeps on coming back, it's a perennial. Once or twice a year, you can chop the leaves back and just drop them around the base of the tree, and they rot down very quickly, and all of that phosphorus and potassium, nitrogen, all back into the soil, where it's then been broken down by the soil food web and made available to the tree roots. If you were to feed the comfrey with an extra source of nitrogen, like weeing, like over here, you could chop and drop them up to 4 or 5 times a year, because they've got all that extra nitrogen that they put back into this leaf, and then you can use that to sort of feed whatever you're feeding. And then human manure, we talked about, I don't know much about it, so I'm not going to advocate it because I don't want anyone to get horrible pathogens or anything. But
Not as good as
there's
urine.
a whole okay,
Not nearly as good as urine.
The thing is, some people are very toxic. I mean, in the sort of stuff that people consume if somebody has really bad nutrition.
I'd
You're
like to
letting it
think
break
that
down.
a lot of forest gardeners are on that kind of journey to a more wholesome diet with a lot more organic, stuff
It's
in there. So,
antibiotics. It's
things
antibiotics
like
that's
that,
the
like.
But also, like the pathogens, so in general, we use manure from herbivores, from ruminants, because that's really great and doesn't have anything nasty in it. But you don't want, for instance, dog poo, although you can use it when it's really well broken
Yeah.
down.
Well, with this,
because
you have to do
if
it
you eat
properly.
meat
Like,
and
yeah.
things like that, it creates really,
Yeah, but it's
potentially
quite an
dangerous
easy,
things.
once you know how to do it, and there's the whole thing called the human Bible or something, I don't know, but it's a very comprehensive way, and it is, once you know how to do it, it's quite, a simple thing to do and quite effective. So, but yeah, you can't just go tossing your shit around liberally, hoping for the best, basically. You've got to kind of learn a bit.
I mean, there's a
about
long
it first.
history of using it as well, isn't there? There's a long history of using it.
Yeah, completely. Yeah.
It used to be collected, didn't it? It's like
Well,
nice
and
or-
you think about now how, again, this idea that a waste product is a problem. It's something we have to deal with and export. And now, very recently, we've passed this threshold where humans are now a predominantly urban species. First time in human history, we're now predominantly urban. So we're expending all of this energy on processing this stuff and figuring out how we can flush it back out into kind of the water systems, when if there was a way, and people are looking into this on an urban level, of how you could process that, turn it into part of the solution, which is nutrient source right where we need it, to grow more of the food right where we're based, to eliminate so many of these problems. So phosphorus, similar reasons. Nitrogen, important for growth, and this whole component of DNA and RNA, which I won't go into too much because I don't really understand it myself, to be honest. It's been a long time since I've gone really into that side of things. But all we need to know is provides energy to sustain growth, and this is important. So it's a major component of the cell membrane. So actually, again, that's why it's important for creating cells and leaves with structural integrity, which aren't predated upon or can't be penetrated easily by the sucking instruments of aphids and things like that. And this one actually comes pretty much solely from the weathering. So we were talking about before of weathering of bedrock and a rock called apatite. And so actually, out of all of these three main macronutrients, this is one that's actually there's less of it in the soil, or less of it in a form that's available to plants, which is why the mycorrhizae sort of specialise in extracting phosphorus and bringing that to the host plant. And so wood ash is high in phosphorus, so again, that could be a point source in a way of nutrition. If you're burning things in the forest garden, if you've got wood burning stoves, if, for example, I know people who are setting up places where they're kind of living out in their forest garden, and they're actually using it to heat water and everything, so they're actually coppicing sweet chestnut, using that wood as fuel, and then using the ash to put back into the system. So a really nice way of keeping that.
And that's the one that's peaking. That's the one when they talk about peak resources, it's the phosphorus that is the one that once it's flushed down the toilet and goes out to sea, that's it, it's gone.
Yeah.
Wood ash is good for both.
Yeah, good
Potassium.
for potassium and so potassium in a moment.
And I can tell you why it's useful as a component of DNA and RNA, because that's adipose triphosphate. So it's actually one of the elements that's in the
So manure again, compost again, but again, when you read Martin Crawford's, what he's saying, well, you can make compost, but it's best just to get the plants to do all this for you, really. Maybe if you're getting the system set up and you had it, in the first few years, you wanted to add that baseline load of nutrients to kind of get things shifting and to, bring that fertility in. But eventually, once you've built in once the nitrogen fixers are doing their work and these fungal connections have been made, then there'll be less of a need to do so. Seaweed as well. So, and then potassium. So needed for creating starch. So that's where the sugar stores, so obviously quite key. Plays a key role in movement of water in and out of cells. So actually, with more potassium, you've got increased drought tolerance. So that's pretty key. Really important for flower and fruit formation because it thickens the cell walls. So this is why using, for example, if you're using a comfrey tea with a fruiting tree or a fruiting shrub, while the fruit's developing, like those tiny pears now just behind you, this time of the year, this is when you would start to, when you were watering that tree, adding some of the comfrey tea because it's high in potassium and it's going to really help to form fruits. And this one, yeah, it is a bit more difficult to sort of to provide from outside sources. So you can get it from urine, get it from comfrey, wood ash. And I was looking into it once. Source, you know, because it's harder to find, is actually using banana skins. And people were talking about using banana skins. Of course, you associate bananas with potassium, so it makes sense that actually there's some in the skins. And this, again, this is covered in the book, so I'm not going to go into the calculations. But essentially, it's a rough balancing of the demand, again, like working out your canopy cover of these different plants with their different needs, and trying to sort of match that sort of supply with the demand. Yeah, and also he notes in the book that actually the calculation he uses is for actually a fully grown system. So he's predicting it from the needs of the trees when they're going to be at their full size. And he gives guides as well as, you know, roughly how big different types of plant are going to be growing as well. It's always going to vary, but again, it doesn't have to be precise. It's a rough kind of balancing, but go to the book to check that out. Or sustainable nitrogen supply, again, it's sustainable if it's mostly from nitrogen fixers, okay, which are planned into it. So he talks about 25 to 30% of your canopy cover should be nitrogen fixers, and up to 40% should be nitrogen fixers if you've got a lot of, you know, improved fruits in there, so your plums and your apples and big human improved fruits.
That would include Eleagnus as well, which I don't think is defined as being in the canopy layer, but it's a good nitrogen fixer.
Yes,
And
sorry, I
it's
thought you
like
meant as an improved fruit. Yeah,
Oh, sorry.
definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so should we have a little look at some soil? Yeah. So back to the soil. There's various tests. I mean, it's really good to start to get to know soil a little bit more. So I think what we could do